Aztec warriors riding velociraptors. A concept so cool it couldn't possibly go wrong, and certainly couldn't end up as one of the worst units in Warhammer history. Welcome to the Wargames Orchard. I'm Nathan Stone, and this is the inaugural episode of Lost Units of Warhammer, a video series exploring the forgotten units of Warhammer Fantasy and 40k. This includes units that ceased to exist after a new edition, army book, or codex. A lot of the units we'll explore either didn't fit in with the rest of the army, never got models, or were a redundant choice, possibly some combination of all three. Today's unit might be one of the most ill-conceived to ever grace the old world, the Skink Cold One Riders. They sound interesting and sure look cool if you're into that hot lizard-riding lizard action, but they might be one of the worst cavalry units in the history of Warhammer Fantasy. The Lizardmen Army Book of 1996 was the first introduction of the Lizardmen as a playable army in Warhammer Fantasy since they had last appeared in the Old Hammer era. This version totally remade the army and its lore, combining two Old Hammer forces of the Lizardmen and the Slann into one more coherent force for a more streamlined era. The Lizardmen, alongside Bretonnia, kicked off the brand new 5th edition of Warhammer Fantasy by joining the existing forces of the Warhammer world. That 5th edition Lizardmen army turned out to be great! A competitive tome full of strong choices. Slann Mage Priests, Skinks, Karoxagors were all incredible choices, and the Lizardmen army could dominate just about any phase of the game. The book was so competitive that even the less competitive choices were still playable, except for one. Which one? I mean, you know which one. It's in the title of the video, come on. It wasn't a bad idea in the beginning. The Lizardmen army needed a cavalry unit. Heavy cavalry doesn't really make sense, given this is a civilization that lives in ultra-dense jungles. Light cavalry works better. Fast-moving scouts made for a lore-friendly way to include cavalry in an otherwise very infantry-heavy force. Games Workshop already had dark elves mounted on Cold Ones, giant raptor-like lizards that live in the New World. It was only fitting that you'd give them to the Lizardmen as well. And if they're going to be light cavalry, then slow, cumbersome Saurus wouldn't be the choice you want to go with. Skinks would be the riders of choice. It all makes sense. So much sense! But all that would come out of this unholy union was a hot mess. To understand what went wrong with this unit, we first need to take a look at its stats and rules. Here it is. And as we can see, there's been some interesting choices made. Movement 8 is nice and quick, no problem there. Oh, but then we see Weapon Skill 2 on the rider. Okay, well, not ideal on a unit that has to fight in close combat to deal damage. Ballistic skill doesn't factor in here, so then we're on 2 strength. 4 is good. There'll be 5 on the charge with their spears. It's just a shame that with 1 Weapon Skill 2 attack, they're probably not hitting a lot. Hey, well, at least they have a Cold One adding its own 2 Strength 4 attacks. The hitting power of this unit would be fine if not for the low accuracy of the rider and the mount. That's not the real problem with this unit, though. I'm sure you've already spotted it. Yeah, it's the 2 toughness. And yes, the Cold One is toughness 4, but no, that doesn't matter, since we have to go off the rider's toughness. Honestly, this is just a bizarre choice. Toughness 2 cavalry at 25 points per model is just non-functional. In combat against a basic human stat line, these models will hit on 3s and wound on 3s. Sotek save you if you find yourself in combat with anything mightier than that. This unit is already bad, and we haven't reached the end of the stat block, where we'll find another real problem. Leadership 6 on a Cold One unit. A unit that needs to test leadership every turn to avoid spending the whole turn sniffing each other's asses. Now, I'm being a little dramatic here, since the cold-blooded rule means that the riders can test on 3 dice and drop the highest. But even then, success is no sure thing. The end result was a fragile, unreliable unit that really had no place in the army. The riders could have benefited from more options, including bows, though that wouldn't have solved the biggest issue of toughness 2 and low leadership. Even the few uses that they had were already done better by pterodons, which could fly and had ranged attacks to boot. Strangely, Skink Cold One Riders hold the distinction of having the first and only Lizardmen Dogs of War mercenary unit, Teechi-Hwachi's Raiders, who despite having some interesting special rules, suffered from all of the problems that made the normal riders terrible. There was also a special character, Inixi Huanzi, who rode a horned one, a hornier and therefore stronger version of a cold one. As a character, Inixi escapes most of the pitfalls of the Skink Riders. He's toughness 3, weapon skill 4, and his mount isn't subject to stupidity. He also has a ranged attack in the form of poison darts that he can use whilst charging or being charged. He's got some use, which makes him infinitely better than the base unit. Skink Cold One Riders would only exist for a short time in Warhammer Fantasy. Their last appearance in the Lizardmen army list was in Ravening Hordes, the Get You By army list compendium released in 2000 at the start of 6th edition. Somehow they were even worse there, with the Skinks dropping to strength 3. By the time a proper Lizardmen army book was released for 6th edition, the Skinks had ceded their cavalry duties to the Saurus, who would turn out to be much better suited to the role, and would keep the job all the way into the Age of Sigmar. Skink Cold One Riders were ultimately undone by Games Workshop being unwilling to change the basic stats of Skinks and the rules around cavalry to make them work. And by not doing so, they got the worst of both worlds, and made, in my opinion, one of the worst units in the history of Warhammer. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it and want to see more of this series and similar, please like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments what lost units you'd like to see me cover, or your pick for the worst unit of all time. If you like what I talk about and the way I talk about it, check out the War Games Orchard podcast for tons of Warhammer talk. Thanks to our patrons for making this possible. Our Patreon is where we upload bonus episodes of the podcast and is a great way to help us out. You can check that out at patreon.com/wargamesorchard.